The evening sun spilled its fading warmth through the dusty window of the small traditional California home, casting long, trembling beams that settled over the wooden floor like memories refusing to die. And in the center of that quiet, amber-lit room sat Evelyn, her frail body wrapped in a wear-upon shawl she had made many years ago when her fingers were still strong and her eyes still clear, and beside her on the small rug, cross-legged and wide-eyed, sat her granddaughter Lily, who looked up at her with that innocent curiosity only a child untouched by the world could carry. And Evelyn, with her wrinkled hands resting gently in her lap, hands that had cooked meals, wiped tears, buried loved ones, held newborns, worked in cold mornings and long nights, felt the weight of a lifetime pressing against her chest as she prepared to tell a story she had kept inside for far too long. A story of loss, betrayal, sacrifice, and the strange, stubborn hope that somehow always survived inside her no matter how many times life tried to crush it. And as she exhaled slowly, the room seemed to quiet itself in reverence, as though even the shadows leaned closer to listen. And her voice, soft but trembling with unspoken pain, began drifting into the dim golden air, telling Lily how just a few years ago, before the little girl was born, before Evelyn's hair had fully surrendered to white, she had believed she finally reached a point in her life where peace was possible, where she had given enough, lost enough, survived enough, and all she wanted was a single family vacation, a simple gathering, something to remind her that all her sacrifices had meaning. So she paid for every ticket, every reservation, every detail, imagining laughter echoing across hotel balconies and dinners filled with warmth rather than the cold silence she endured alone. But then came the text message, so abrupt and cruel that the memory of it still cut through her like glass, her own son telling her, without shame, without softness, that she would not be joining them because his wife preferred to keep her family together, implying that Evelyn, who had given birth to him, raised him, fed him, protected him, cried for him, prayed for him, was somehow no longer part of her own son's family. And Lily, with her small hand now gripping Evelyn's trembling fingers, whispered, "But Nana, why would he say that?" And Evelyn, her eyes glistening under the fading light, explained in a voice cracked by time that sometimes children forget the hands that held them. Sometimes they grow into adults who mistake convenience for love. And sometimes life twists people into strangers. And she told Lily how she froze the travel plans, watching the screen blur as tears filled her eyes, realizing that even though she had done everything right, even though she had given everything she had, she was still unwanted, still pushed aside, still left alone. And as she spoke, memories from decades earlier flooded through her, the tiny kitchen of her childhood home where she stirred soup while her sick mother coughed in the next room. The long days of washing clothes in cold water while her friends played in the sun. The moments of girlhood stolen by responsibility. The love she found with Daniel under the old olive tree before fate took him away too soon. The way her heart broke at 20 and still kept beating. Her marriage to Lily's grandfather and the quiet, devoted life they built together until death separated them too. And she spoke of motherhood, the way she poured her whole being into her sons. How she worked extra shifts, ate less so they could eat more, swallowed her sorrow so they could grow without its weight, endured loneliness so they could feel safety, and still, in the end, one of them had looked at her as though she were a burden instead of the woman who had carried him into this world. And Lily's eyes filled with tears she didn't fully understand as she leaned her small head against Evelyn's leg. And Evelyn gently rested a shaky hand on her granddaughter's hair, whispering that she wasn't telling this story to make her sad, but to help her understand that life is not always fair. People are not always kind, and love, real love, often comes from the places we least expect, sometimes from those younger than us. Sometimes from those who simply listen when we speak. And she smiled through her tears because despite everything she had lost, despite the betrayal that carved another scar across her heart, She still had this moment with Lily, this soft, fragile moment where the past hurt a little less simply because someone cared enough to hear it. And the room, warm and humming with the quiet of evening, held them gently in its fading light as Evelyn continued speaking, her story stretching out like a long, unbroken thread of memory, painful, tender, and achingly human. And so the night deepened around them, the soft chorus of crickets rising outside the small wooden home, as though nature itself wished to accompany Evelyn's trembling confession. And Lily, still leaning against her grandmother's leg, looked up with eyes reflecting both innocence and a dawning understanding far beyond her years. And Evelyn, sensing the child's quiet yearning to know more, allowed her memories to unfurl once again, each one emerging like a fragile shard of a life she had tried so hard to piece together even as the world continued breaking it apart. For what she had told Lily was only the surface, a thin layer over the ocean of truths she had buried deep within her soul. Truths she had never spoken aloud, not to her sons, not to her late husband, not even to herself in the quietest nights, but now, with the warm weight of her granddaughter's hand around her fingers, she felt something loosening inside her, like an old locked door creaking open after decades of silence. And she continued, her voice delicate yet steady, describing how after the vacation incident she found herself walking through her days like a ghost, unable to understand how her own child could dismiss her so casually. How the messages stopped altogether, how she stopped hearing from him and his wife, how birthdays passed without a call, how she watched other families gather in parks or restaurants while she sat alone in the little home she and her late husband had built with their bare hands. A home filled with memories but starved of visitors. And Lily's small fingers tightened as if trying to hold together the pieces of her grandmother's sorrow. And Evelyn smiled sadly, explaining that she had once imagined her later years filled with noisy weekends. Grandchildren running through hallways, the smell of soup on the stove and laughter bouncing off walls. But instead she sat at quiet tables, ate meals by herself, waited for phone calls that never came, and she remembered the mornings when she would wake early to cook for her sons when they were little. The way they used to cling to her skirt. The way she would wipe their faces clean and kiss their foreheads before sending them to school, and she wondered quietly, painfully, how the small boys who once needed her so desperately could grow into men who treated her as though she were disposable. And Lily whispered, "Nana, I'll never leave you," and Evelyn's heart cracked open in a place she didn't know still existed. And she brushed her thumb tenderly against Lily's cheek, as if to anchor herself in a moment of love she feared was too fragile to last. And then her voice drifted further back, deeper into the shadows of her past, telling Lily how before she ever became a mother she had known loneliness even as a young woman, working double shifts in diners, saving pennies just to survive. How she had once dreamed of studying, traveling, becoming something more than a caretaker, but life had pulled her in other directions, first her sick mother, then the endless job that drained her strength, then the marriage that brought comfort, but also responsibilities she carried alone more often than she admitted. And she described the years when her children were small and money was tight, nights when she would pretend she had already eaten just so her sons could have enough. Mornings when she walked to work because gas was a luxury. All the moments she hid her tears behind bathroom doors because she didn't want her boys to worry. And these images raw and unfiltered filled the dim room like ghosts of the past returning to witness her truth being spoken at last. And Lily listened without blinking, her breath soft and steady, absorbing every word like it was a treasure instead of a burden. And Evelyn continued, her voice growing softer as she described how her husband fell ill in his later years, how she nursed him with devotion even when her own back ached and her joints throbbed, how she fed him spoon by spoon, wiped his mouth, whispered prayers over him, and held his hand the night he took his final breath, a moment that shattered her in a way nothing else had. leaving her alone in the world with only her sons to depend on, or so she thought. But grief had a cruel way of revealing truths, and after her husband's death, her sons drifted farther, their visits becoming rare, their calls shorter, their affection colder, until one day she realized she had become an afterthought in the lives she had once built with her own sacrifices. And Lily, hearing this, crawled into her grandmother's lap even though she was a bit too big for it, wrapping small arms around Evelyn's torso. And Evelyn let out a breath that trembled with both gratitude and heartbreak, holding the child close as if gathering her strength from her little body. And she whispered that life had taught her again and again that sometimes the people you love most will hurt you without looking back. But sometimes, just sometimes, God sends someone new, someone small and unexpected, to heal wounds that seemed permanent. And she kissed Lily's head, inhaling the scent of childhood and hope, and she went on, describing how she survived the days after the hurtful message from her son, how she cooked small meals for herself even when she had no appetite, how she watered her garden even when she felt too heavy to stand, how she sat on the porch and watched the world move on without her. And yet somewhere within her something stubborn refused to die, a tiny spark that whispered she was still worthy of love, still deserving of joy, still a woman with a heart capable of giving. And that spark grew brighter the day Lily was born. When she first held a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets, her son Lily's fat, the night outside deepened into a velvet darkness, and the small lamp beside Evelyn cast a warm halo around her and little Lily, who remained curled in her grandmother's lap as though she had always belonged there, her tiny fingers clutching the soft fabric of Evelyn's shawl as if afraid the story this long, aching confession might float away if she didn't hold onto something tightly. And Evelyn, feeling the delicate weight of the child against her, let memories rise again from the hidden corners of her heart, each one carrying the heaviness of years she had lived alone inside her silence. Her voice now a tender whisper blending with the sounds of the night as she continued revealing how the distance between her and her younger son had not simply appeared one morning, but had grown slowly, silently, like cracks beneath a painted wall, unnoticed until suddenly everything was breaking. And she told Lily how she tried to ignore the signs, the hurried phone calls, the cancelled visits, the shift in his tone whenever she asked for just a little time with him, how she told herself he was busy, tired, stressed, but deep inside she felt the cold dread that something precious was slipping from her fingers. And Lily listened, her heart aching even though she did not yet know the world well enough to understand its cruelties. And she held her grandmother's hand so tightly that Evelyn felt strength in her tiny grasp, and so she kept speaking, remembering the lonely years after her husband's death when she woke up to cold rooms and quiet mornings, how she made coffee for one instead of two, how she sat at the kitchen table listening to the ticking clock because it was the only sound that reminded her she was still alive. And she described the night she stood on the porch hearing the laughter of her neighbors' families, imagining herself among them, imagining the life she once dreamed of, full of grandchildren, full of company, full of noise, but instead she lived inside silence. And she would close her eyes and whisper prayers, asking God to bring her children back to her, asking for forgiveness if she had ever failed them without knowing, asking for strength to keep her heart open even when it hurt. And Lily, hearing this, pressed her forehead to Evelyn's chest as if trying to protect her from pain that had already passed. And Evelyn kissed the child's hair gently, whispering that sometimes the people we love most forget us not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. Because life distracts, and responsibilities multiply, and distance grows even between hearts that were once inseparable. But she told Lily she never stopped believing love would return somehow, even after her younger son sent the message that shattered her, even after he pushed her away as though she were no longer family. She still believed love had a strange, stubborn way of finding its way back. And as she held Lily close, she felt that belief warming her again. Because sometimes love does not return through the same people, it returns through new ones, through children like Lily, whose arms wrapped around her now with a tenderness that soothed every wound time had carved. And as the night wrapped around them like a soft blanket, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment and let her memory settle, knowing there was still so much to tell. So many truths buried in the quiet corners of her heart still waiting to be spoken. The next morning rose softly, its pale light creeping through the thin curtains and painting the room in shades of gold and dust. And Lily, still sleepy-eyed, shuffled toward her grandmother, who was already sitting by the window with a cup of warm tea cradled between her fragile hands. And when the child curled up beside her, Evelyn smiled, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and weariness. And without needing to be asked, she continued her life story, her words drifting into the quiet morning air like incense from a burning memory, telling Lily how after her husband passed she tried to rebuild herself, tried to find purpose in the small things: gardening, knitting blankets, volunteering at the church, but the loneliness clung to her like an invisible shadow. Especially on holidays when she set an extra plate at the table out of habit, knowing no one would sit there, yet unable to bear removing it because it felt like admitting defeat. And she described how every Christmas she wrapped gifts for her sons even when they no longer visited, keeping them on her dresser until the wrapping paper faded, because letting go of traditions felt like letting go of hope. And she told Lily how her younger son began visiting less and less, showing up with cold eyes and rushed conversations, always checking his phone, always leaving early, until one day he didn't come at all, and she remembered calling him, hearing the distant hesitation in his voice as he told her he was too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed, and the excuses piled up like stones on her chest. And she told Lily how she wondered if she had unknowingly done something wrong, if she had become too old, too slow, too fragile to be worth their time, but she tried to stay strong, reminding herself that love should not have to beg for a place. And yet she still waited for calls that didn't come. Birthdays passed unanswered, and she learned to hold her emotions in silence, because the world does not pause for old women's tears. And she described how the day she received that devastating message from her younger son, the message that banished her from the vacation she had paid for, she felt something inside her collapse, something she had held together for decades. And she sat in her kitchen staring at the screen while the tea she made grew cold, wondering how the boy she once carried on her hip, the boy she once protected from bullies, the boy she once nursed through fevers and nightmares, could now speak to her as if she were a stranger intruding on his life. And she told Lily she froze the travel plans not out of anger but out of heartbreak, because she could not imagine showing up where she wasn't wanted, could not force herself into a memory that was meant to be joyful but now carried the taste of betrayal. And Lily, with her small voice trembling, whispered, "But Nana, you deserve love. You deserve them to come to you." And Evelyn smiled gently, brushing Lily's cheek and telling her that sometimes we love people who do not know how to love us back. And sometimes God allows our hearts to break so they can open wider, wider than we ever thought possible, because loss teaches us to value kindness, and heartbreak teaches us to recognize genuine love when it finally appears. And she looked at Lily's innocent face and whispered that love had, in fact, returned to her through the child sitting beside her, because Lily reminded her of everything good that had not been lost: her ability to nurture, her capacity to care, her longing for connection. And as the morning sunlight warmed her skin, Evelyn felt a fragile but undeniable hope rising within her again, knowing her story was far from over, knowing she still had pages left to live and share. That afternoon, the wind outside picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the yard and sending them swirling in small, frantic circles, and inside the house Evelyn and Lily sat together on the couch, the air thick with the sense that the story was moving into deeper, darker waters, and Evelyn, her fingers twisting the corner of her shawl, began to speak again. Her voice low and steady as she revisited memories she rarely allowed herself to touch, telling Lily about the years when she tried desperately to rebuild her relationship with her younger son. How she baked his favorite desserts whenever she heard he might visit. How she kept his room tidy just in case he came unexpectedly. How she sent messages filled with warmth only to receive short, distant replies that felt colder than silence. And she told Lily how she tried to understand his wife, tried to give her kindness, respect, space. But no matter how softly she stepped, no matter how carefully she tried to avoid offense, the woman never warmed to her, seeing Evelyn not as family but as a burden waiting to happen. And the tension grew until even Evelyn's attempts at love were interpreted as intrusions. And she described the day she overheard her daughter-in-law whispering harsh words in the hallway, words that cut deeper than any blade, that Evelyn was too old, too fragile, too much trouble, that she would only make vacations stressful, that she did not fit with their lifestyle. And Evelyn remembered standing there unable to breathe, pressing a hand to her own chest as though she could hold her breaking heart together. And she told Lily how she walked away quietly so they would not know she had heard, because the pain was too fresh to speak of, and she carried that wound silently, hoping time would soften it. But instead the distance grew wider, and she described how with each silent holiday, each unanswered message, each passing year, the realization sank deeper that her son had chosen a life in which she had no place, a life where she was an afterthought, a life where she existed only as a distant obligation. And Lily's small hands balled into fists as she whispered, "That's not fair. That's not what love is." And Evelyn kissed her forehead gently, whispering that life is not always fair, but we cannot let the unfairness harden us. And she continued, her voice trembling as she recounted the night she sat at the edge of her bed staring at old photo albums, seeing the bright-eyed boys she raised. Boys who once clung to her, who once cried into her shoulder, who once promised they would always take care of her. And she wondered how promises made in childhood could vanish like smoke, how a lifetime of sacrifice could be forgotten in a few short years. And she told Lily she had forgiven them long before they ever asked, because forgiveness was not a gift to her sons, it was a gift she gave herself so she could continue breathing without the weight crushing her. And as she spoke, Lily wrapped her arms around her grandmother's waist, holding her as if trying to fill the spaces where love had once lived. And Evelyn felt warmth blooming inside her again, fragile but real, reminding her that even after storms tear apart everything you build, sometimes a small hand, a small heart can help you rebuild something new. By evening, the sun dipped low behind the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and ruby, and the warm glow filtered into the room where Evelyn and Lily remained together, their bond thickened by hours of shared truth. And Evelyn, feeling both drained and lighter than she had in years, began to speak once more, this time recounting not just her pain, but the resilience that had allowed her to survive it, telling Lily how she learned to reinvent her life after heartbreak, how she started walking every morning through the garden her husband once tended, how she planted new flowers as though planting new chapters of herself, how she cooked small meals even when she had no appetite because she knew keeping herself alive was its own quiet act of rebellion. And she explained how she began baking cookies for the neighborhood children, how she wore upon blankets for the church drive, how she found joy in giving even when she received nothing in return, because generosity had always been her language of love, and she would not let sorrow steal it from her. And she told Lily how she found comfort in prayer, in whispered conversations with God during lonely nights, asking Him to soften her heart when bitterness tried to creep in, asking Him to protect her sons even when they forgot her, asking Him to fill the empty spaces within her with something gentle. And she told Lily how, slowly, She began to feel peace again, not from her children returning to her, because they didn't, but from realizing that her worth was not measured by how others treated her, but by the goodness she continued to offer the world. And she took Lily's hand and whispered that love is not a transaction but a river, and some rivers change course, leaving dry beds behind, but others find new paths and flow even stronger than before. And Lily leaned her head against Evelyn's shoulder as she listened, absorbing every piece of wisdom like sunlight on her skin. And Evelyn told her how she learned to stop waiting for the apology that never came, how she learned to stop rehearsing conversations she would never get to have, how she learned to stop imagining different endings for the stories that had already been written, and instead she began focusing on the blessings still ahead of her. Blessings she did not yet know the shape of, blessings like Lily herself, who had walked into her life like a sunrise after years of darkness, bringing warmth back into places that had grown cold. And as the final light of day slipped away, Evelyn wrapped her arms around her granddaughter and whispered that no matter how broken her past had been, no matter how much pain she had carried, moments like this, small, quiet, profound, made every loss worth enduring. Because love, when it arrives pure and unconditional, can heal even the deepest wounds. And Lily whispered back, "I'll always stay with you, Nana," and Evelyn closed her eyes, letting those words wash over her like a promise. A bomb, a gift from a universe that had finally given something back, and the night settled around them like a soft embrace, holding them gently as Evelyn's story, though long and heavy, left them both wrapped in a shared, unshakable warmth that neither time nor distance could ever take away.